Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball. So here we are, it's episode 20, and this week I think we're talking about something I find actually pretty interesting because just talking about how you determine, what we're talking about is who the best player in each franchise is. But I think it's an interesting question of how you determine that because you have some of these franchises that have changed drastically over their history.
And we're probably going to get into trouble with some people because this is just a matter of opinion.
Yeah.
We're thinking based on what we've seen and what we evaluate, and we'll talk about a little bit about the evaluation aspect of this. But
and just
somebody's going to be upset that we didn't pick their favorite player.
Exactly. And one of the toughest questions to answer at first is you have these franchises just to bring up the Dodgers sort of as an example, that you've got the Dodgers who were a storied franchise in both Brooklyn and Los Angeles, but the fans, I think we've kind of talked about in the past, the fans of both of those franchises, while there is some crossover, it's less and less with each passing year, obviously, and it's a disconnected history. So who's the best? Is it one for each? Is it only, are there great LA Dodgers left off because a guy from Brooklyn needs to get included?
Should it be since 1960 or something?
And that's a team that kept the same name.
Right.
What if you took some of these teams that changed names? There's almost no connection to the old identity at that point.
I think in the case of the Dodgers, you have to look back at the history in the 50s and 60s. That was such an important part of their history when they moved to Los Angeles, and that move was so significant. So you have to consider that if we're going to look at it mostly, I would say, maybe not entirely, as modern franchise.
I think it's just easier if you keep it that way, because then otherwise it gets a lot trickier. Just because you're comparing a lot of times guys from a really old era of baseball where it's the same but not quite the same.
Right. For this old baseball fan, right, any list that you talk about all-time players that doesn't include guys like Walter Johnson and Jimmy Fox, but those guys played 100 or 90 years ago. So we're going to try to put that aside. We may reference them now and again because those were great dynamic players, but the Philadelphia A's are a long way from the Oakland A's. And by the way, they went through Kansas City also.
But I think on average, still, this list is going to be the type of list, and these discussions are going to center on players that are generally older just because the onset of free agency has changed how players are with their franchises. It's much more unusual for a single guy to stay with one franchise over his entire career, where that used to be every player for the most part.
Well, and Curt Flood, and the reserve clause back in 1970 made all the difference because he fought for it, and eventually the league had to succumb to it, and then players were able to make some deals so they didn't have to spend their entire career with the team simply because they couldn't get out of the contract.
Exactly. So I think it's just that has an interesting kind of ripple effect on a discussion like this, just because guys tend to spend more time with they spend the majority of their career with a bunch of different franchises as opposed to just one. So
let's go down the list, and we'll go team by team. And I think we just kind of started almost in the way the teams finished this year.
Just because it was there, yeah.
Because it was just a way to look at it. So, okay, give me your all-time best, we'll call it Atlanta Brave. I'll let you go to Milwaukee if you want, but not Boston.
I think this one's kind of easy in some respects. Just because this is one of those things where there's a couple franchises where I think it's like this. It's Hank Aaron.
Right, and I'd agree 100%. But for those, there are a lot of people,
there are great
that have never seen Frank Aaron play that are giant baseball fans now.
You say Frank Aaron?
Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron.
Sorry.
Hank Aaron, who've never seen him play. Bad Henry, as it were. And there's some other great Braves who should be on that all-time list. Guys like Eddie Matthews.
Greg Maddux, for sure. Warren Spahn, possibly the greatest lefty of all time. Yeah, but it's the problem in this, it's one of those things where it's the problem is your competition is Hank Aaron.
Right, and Hank Aaron just represents everything good about baseball, and a guy who not only held the all-time home record, was a long-time contributor to that, never won a World Series in Atlanta, but he did win one with Milwaukee before they moved to Atlanta. So I think that that having that championship
kind of helps a little bit.
I think it does. If you're an all-time player,
especially
it really
in the context of being a franchise's greatest player, because this is something where it's what you brought to that team, and having a championship's a big deal. And there's going to be a lot of times where it's yeah, but that guy was the key player on the one team that won the World Series for that franchise. Kind of big deal.
Now, of course, we're going to eliminate a couple of teams who have not won championships, that being the Padres and the Rockies in the National League. So you're not going to be able to have a guy be the number one player because he was a World Series winner if they never won.
Exactly.
So, okay, how about the Marlins? I'll go for the Marlins first. Mm-hmm. And my all-time Marlin is going to be a guy who now plays for the Yankees. It's Giancarlo Stanton.
I think this is a really hard one because they haven't really been around that long. So, and because they've been a team that's only existed during the free agency era, and because of the way they're run as an organization, they haven't had many guys stick around with them and had storied careers, specifically this team.
And I just sort of, went back on what I said before because Stanton did not win a World Series with the Marlins, and yet I pick him as the all-time Marlin. And guys like Josh Beckett, was a pitcher on a World. They won two World Series.
They won a World Series in '97 and then a World Series in '03.
Yep.
But I don't think Beckett was a part of the 97 one.
No, he was only the second one.
I think the only guy that might have been a part of both was Luis Castillo.
I think you might be right. He also holds like a bunch of Marlin all-time
He was
records.
one of their better, but like it's tough for me, especially as a
He can't
Met
catch
fan.
a pop fly.
Yeah, especially as a Met fan to say he was the best player in franchise history because he was just like a really good second baseman.
Yeah, he hit 290 for his career.
I think another guy
solid
like
player,
Hanley Ramirez might be up there.
Yep. I'd agree.
Again, like a lot of his really amazingly productive years actually were for the Red Sox and the Dodgers.
And we don't put Miguel Cabrera, or I didn't put Miguel Cabrera on this list, even though he won a World Series with the Marlins as a very young player, was a very good player. But I think he only spent 4 or 5 years with the Marlins.
Yeah, and you would definitely count as he would be up there for another franchise, certainly.
Right. So I think there is, although you can't limit it to years, I kind of feel you got to be there for, my feeling is something like 7 or 8 years at least in order to be a franchise's best player. I mean, if you were there for 4 years, how could you be the franchise's best player?
That just doesn't work.
I don't feel that way either. Okay, so how about you with the Phillies? One of the other things, but the Phillies are an old team.
They're an old team, but
they should have a lot of guys. So all the old teams, right? That go back to the turn of the 20th century.
They have some old guys, and there's still some newer guys on there.
They have never moved. They've been in Philly the entire time.
But I think this is actually another pretty easy one.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's Mike Schmidt.
Yeah.
like you have guys like Steve Carlton. You've got even guys like Jimmy Rollins is up there, but none of those guys are Mike Schmidt.
Some Philly fans would tell you Dick Allen was a terrific player, should be on that list. And as much as I don't like the player, I'd have to throw Chase Utley in there as an all-time Philly. Yeah. But Michael guys. Jack Schmidt is the guy.
Because Schmidt's he's in the conversation for GOAT for third base.
Oh, I'm not in the conversation.
Wait, he's one of the no. I'm talking about if you're drawing up your short list, he's probably one of like 2 or 3 guys on that list.
Who's number 2 even?
Maybe Robinson.
Brooks Robinson?
Just from a defensive
a better defender than Schmidt.
Right, but Schmidt was an infinitely more devastating
but Schmidt had the glove
player.
and he had
exactly.
Eddie Matthews was a great third baseman, but again, Michael Schmidt.
He wasn't Michael Schmidt.
Yeah, I feel Mike Schmidt is the guy there for sure.
So I think that's an easy one. So then next, I think this is an interesting one because they were an expansion franchise as well, and they've never been one that's had a ton of success up until very recently. So I don't know if it'd be any of the recent guys, but the Expos and the National franchise.
And thank you for saying Expos National, because the Nationals themselves have only been around for 15 years or something like that. Mm-hmm. When they moved from Montreal, I think after 2004.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, the Expos came in the league, as we said, in 1969, and they had some great, but never won a World Series. The Nationals did it, but I think
in my mind, it actually only comes down to 3 guys.
Okay.
Maybe 4, but I think 3 is more fair. I think the 3 guys are 2 Expos and 1 Nationals players. Mm-hmm. You got Gary Carter.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Obviously, Gary Carter. I'd say Tim Raines deserves to be on there.
Yes.
And then Ryan Zimmerman.
Ooh, Okay, so I have a giant Ryan Zimmerman bias. I don't like this player.
You don't like him?
I never liked this player.
He deserves to be on there. That guy has been he was the number one pick. He was like their star player from the very beginning of the Nationals as a franchise. He's been with them the entire career.
He just hung around there for a long time.
But he was a good player, a very good player.
I would not pick Zimmerman. I love Gary Carter and Rock
Maybe
Raines.
Strasburg.
I think Strasburg, and for a couple of reasons, Strasburg, and that is, unlike Bryce Harper, he was there for the championship last year. He's pitched 10 years for the Nationals.
And he's been a National his whole life.
His career record is dynamite. It's
very
112 and 50 or so, and it's very, very good. So I like that better, and I like that better than Zimmerman, but I admit my Ryan Zimmerman bias. And then there's another easy one, and it's our favorite team, and I think pretty much anybody that thinks about the Mets, that knows anything about the Mets, knows who we're going to pick.
Yeah, I think we could just go straight into the honorable mentions for this one because it's just like I think there's two guys I think that compete for number 2.
Well, they say number 1 first.
Okay, fine. Tom Seaver.
Yeah, exactly.
We all know it. We don't need to talk about it.
We had a bottle. My friend Mark Ricard got me a bottle of GTS, George Thomas Seaver wine. Seaver made great wine. It was a fantastic. So when he passed away recently, sat down on a Saturday night and just poured a glass and thought of Tom. Terrific. Clearly the number 1. Longevity, performance, World Series, all those things. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So then for number 2, I think it comes down to 2 guys.
I do too.
Piazza and Wright.
Yeah, I wanted to argue Jerry Koosman a little bit, and I tried.
He just doesn't mean the same thing. Those two guys, what they mean to the franchise is just so much more.
And then that is as much to do that Koosman was obfuscated by Seaver, being the number 2 guy. And even though he pitched for 2 pennant-winning teams, 1 World Series team, pitched a long time for the Mets. He had a long career with the Mets, and is an excellent pitcher.
But Wright was Captain America for the Mets, and he is one of the most beloved players in franchise history.
And Piazza looked like Captain America.
And Piazza has the home run after 9/11. And that's not a Met moment. That is a baseball moment.
And he also made the franchise relevant after they weren't. That was a huge thing to have him come in and suddenly change the way that. I would honorable mention as a 5th guy, Doc Gooden, who pitched most of his productive seasons with the Mets as a great pitcher. Well, that was actually there were quite a few, but he doesn't meet Seaver, certainly, and might not even meet Koosman as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and so then I think it's interesting because, from the Mets, now we move from the NL East to the NL Central, and you've got a lot more storied franchises, and just in terms of the length that they've been around. I think it's interesting because looking at the Central, there's a lot of teams where I think it's actually kind of easy to call who the best player in franchise history is, or it's really hard for some teams just because the competition is so insane.
So, we start with this year's Central Division winner, the Cubs.
And I think this is an easy one.
I'm glad that you would think so, and anybody that's a Cub fan would agree. I didn't see him play as his primary position when he won back-to-back MVPs. As a shortstop, he was a first baseman by the time that I started watching him play, and that's Mr. Sunshine Ernie Banks.
Yeah, it's Ernie Banks.
But how about your honorable mentions there? So you've got a bunch of other great Cubs, and I'm assuming Hack Wilson, who has the National League record for RBIs of 190 in a season back in 1930 or something like that, is not on your list.
No, I think it's a guy like Ryan Sandberg.
Yeah, that dude was a player. That dude was a great player. In fact, to some reason, I think he's almost underappreciated today a little bit, how good he was.
Because from what I recall, I
Cubs
could be
didn't win.
Wrong about this. They were not particularly good when he was there.
They made it to the playoffs in '84 and lost to the Giants, but he didn't get a lot of postseason opportunities.
And especially back in the day when the majority of your national exposure was through the postseason, it gets a little bit harder if you're not making it consistently there to have your name be known in the same sort of way.
Another guy I put on the list, and it's funny, I have 3 guys on my list that all played together with Ernie Banks. Ron Santo. You may not know that much about Ron Santo.
Third baseman?
He was a third baseman, yeah, and a average hitter, great fielder, in the race every year for MVP. But I guess I was just a little too young when I first started watching him play, and he looked like a good, not great player. And he passed away sadly not long ago before he was inducted into Hall of Fame. And I think that's one of the sad things about Ron Santo, that he didn't get to see himself inducted. Really good player, and probably not on most people's list. And then a guy that I really thought was a great player who was not in the Hall of Fame is Billy Williams.
I do not know particularly much about Mr. Williams.
Mm-hmm. Well, Billy Williams played first base. Big, strong left-handed hitter, hit 470 home runs.
Pretty good.
Batted for average, played on those Cubs teams back in the 50s and 60s, was on the 69 Cub team. That was a great team. So I would have him on my list. Again, the thing about the Cubs is they've been around since 1902 or something like that. So it's really hard. Actually, they predate the 20th century because they were called something else. There's going to be a lot of players on there.
Yeah,
but the players
that's where it gets really hard with these,
like
some of these just ancient franchises.
But when you don't win a World Series from, they were in the World Series in 06, they lost to the White Sox, they won in 7 and 8, and then they didn't win again until 2016. So that's going to be hard to be an all-time Cub to some degree because you don't have that championship that goes with it.
That kind of helps elevate you above your peers.
I think so too. So the second place team, and I give us a little credit because we talked about this before the season.
We thought they were a dark horse.
Would be the Reds, who went out ingloriously.
Yes, they went out, but they did not go out well. But I think it's interesting because this one's a little bit trickier, I think, because this is a pretty good 2-horse race.
Well, and the Reds, actually, the Cincinnati Redlegs, they go back to the 1800s as well. So we're not going to go back into the pool and start picking up the 1909 Cincinnati Reds or the 1940 Reds who won a championship. We're going to talk about.
Well, these guys are a little more recent than that, in my mind.
So who's your number one?
This is hard. I think this is one of the hard. This is probably the hardest one we've had so far. I think I go with Pete Rose.
I had him number one, too. First, I had Johnny Bench number one.
Because, he's the other one.
And then I had Pete Rose. And I thought, again, I feel there's ignominy here that the guy who has the most hits is not in the Hall of Fame. And so I feel like if he's not the best player on the team, I can't jump up and down and scream for him to be in the Hall of Fame. I mean, he's the best Red of all time.
Yeah, I think it is really him or Bench. And there are other great players for the Reds.
Right. Obviously, Joe Morgan, who played on that big red machine, terrific player, and Frank Robinson. Frank Robinson, who won an MVP in the National League before he went to the American League, as we talked about, and won one with the Orioles.
I didn't know. For some reason, I didn't think he was a Red.
Oh, yeah. Played for the Reds in the 50s. He won the 56 MVP. Terrific player, and the first African-American manager in the major leagues. So Frank Robinson is on that list, but to me, clearly it's Pete Rose, the guy with the most hits, and with Johnny Bench as an honorable mention, who I could probably have a discussion as possibly the greatest catcher of all time.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's tricky, is that Bench is such an unbelievable, but it's just that's where you're going to get. There's going to be a couple of these franchises, and I think we have another one coming up right after this. That might be even harder.
Yes, I think that's true.
I think the next one might be the hardest or the second hardest, because we all know that there's a certain American League team that's just about impossible.
Right. Well, and again, the Cardinals with their multiple championships, they've got lots of guys who packed that in their saddlebag that I was on a World Series winner, so they're going to have that cred. And, the two guys that I think that come up at the top of that list, and when I wrote, because one of the two guys, I have him as number 2, Bob Gibson just passed away this week, and I put that up. He's arguably the greatest Cardinal of all time, and I don't get a lot of spit back on social media, but I got a few people going, Stan Musial is the greatest of all time. Stan the man.
And there's still other guys that are unbelievable players for the Cardinals that you're not talking about. Rogers Hornsby.
Right. How can Rogers Hornsby not be the greatest Cardinal ever?
And I mean, then you still have guys like Albert Pujols.
Right. He wasn't even on my list.
And he is, when you look at the stats that man had for the Cardinals, wow.
And careers, that go back in time with older Cardinals. And again, this is a continuous franchise, so we can talk about the Cardinals of the 30s.
Exactly. They and that's a leg up. That it's interesting. It's a very interesting situation because in some ways it gives them a leg up because since you've had so many more years, you can have so many more players that have played for you. But at the same time, I think that also makes it a lot harder to figure out who it is because there's so many more guys that are out there.
Right. I put Enos Slaughter as, you can't forget about Enos Country Slaughter. That guy had an amazing career and was on a World Series winner or two. Dizzy Dean, and not only a character, one heck of a pitcher. And
I just don't think he measures up quite towards the top end.
No. So my number one, I'd put Musial at number one, but just.
You could you could sit here all day and argue between him.
I love Bob Gibson. Just love that. I love that player.
So next you have another, I think, an interesting franchise for this discussion because I think this is actually one where, again, it's a two-dog race, and I think I feel differently about this one than you do.
Well, I think you didn't see the guys play, all right? You probably didn't see everybody play, so if you've only seen one. But, yeah, and the Brewers, came into the league in the, I think, the 70s, and so they've had a 50-year history. They haven't won a World Series, so there's nobody on their team who can carry that around with them. Yeah, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So who's your number one?
Molitor.
Huh. Okay, and I have Robin Yount as my number one. You probably never saw Robin Yount play, and you look at his statistics, and they look
now. I don't
good.
think I saw Molitor play for the Brewers.
Right.
I do remember him playing for the Twins.
He was by that time he was a DH. In fact, he was a very capable infielder at second base and sometimes third base for the Brewers early in his career.
Again, that's during a fuzzy part of my memory where, the Brewers are back in the AL Central at that point.
Right. So he could be DHing then, right, which he couldn't do this year. Now, how about a couple of honorable mentions? Who else you got as all-time Brewers?
I think a guy that from the modern era you kind of have to talk about is Ryan Braun.
Yeah, we've talked about him before. And
he's a Hall of Very Good. He's been a Brewer his whole career.
Yep.
He won an MVP with the Brewers.
Yep. I agree a lot.
He's helped them to their deep playoff runs in the recent years that they have had occasionally.
And I think we talked about the fact that his defense was, because he even has a Gold Glove in there. His defense was better than I know him for. Some reason I think he's not great.
Yeah.
But yeah, I put him on the list. I'd also put, and this is just for Brewers fans only, Cecil Cooper on my list, because Cecil Cooper was a great player for the Brewers for a long time on pretty good teams. They did go to the World Series in '82 and lost to the Cardinals. So the Yount was on that team. So you get a little bit of that because that was so exciting for Milwaukee, where they'd never been to the World Series, and then they go and they lose the World Series to Keith Hernandez and the '82 Cardinals. So a storied franchise that also has a history that goes back to 1900, I think even before, would be the Bucks, the Pittsburgh Pirates.
There's a lot of guys at this one.
Right, they've been around for forever, right?
There's a lot of guys. This is a...
So who is your number one Pirate of all time? I have an emotional choice.
That's the problem.
And my head choice. That's
the problem. Is that how do you not pick Clemente? It's Clemente.
Love that player, just like I do Bob Gibson. He was one of my heroes as a kid. That he passed away so tragically, trying to deliver supplies on New Year's Eve. Exactly, adds it. Right. A World Series winner multiple times.
Yeah.
Roberto Clemente, which they tried to make him Bob Clemente in a horrible baseball card, mess back in the in the 60s and 70s. But he wouldn't be in my number one because I think that DeValue is a guy who was way at the beginning of the 20th century, who, if you look at his stats, you just can't believe him and look him up. It's Honus Wagner. And by the way, Honus is just one cool name.
Yeah, it is a cool name. But it's just like... this is one of those ones where it's hard.
Yeah, I think I said that Clemente for an emotional reason and for his contributions to the game. And Honus Wagner actually had some pretty interesting contributions to the game.
He's just from this era of baseball that we just don't talk about in the same way.
So he was the guy that they put his picture on a baseball card and put tobacco in there, and he made them not release the card because he didn't believe in smoking. This is back like in 1909.
That's wild, actually.
Right. So the most valuable baseball card for years was the Honus Wagner 26-01 card, because he stopped them from printing them because he wouldn't allow his likeness to be used because they were selling it with tobacco. So anyway, he gets a little cred for that, right? We give Clemente cred for his, contributions on and off the field. But certainly those two guys, honorable mentions to Ralph Kiner, who had a short but terrific career, home runs. I think he led the league in home runs 10 years in a row, which is pretty good.
It's pretty good.
And Willie Pops Stargell.
Oh yeah, that's the thing. You start. There's just lists of just these unbelievable.
But they're not the greatest Pirates of all time. But they're
Exactly.
great Pirates, great all-time Pirates, right?
Certainly.
You could do a team about that. Okay, so you talked about them before, right? And we said about their history. And I'm interested to see how you're going to handle this because as we talk about the Superbas, and then they were the Robins before they were actually called the Dodgers, not until 1932. They played in Brooklyn until 1958 when they moved to Los Angeles, where they remain today.
And I think the way I'm going to answer this is to take the coward's way out. So the Brooklyn Dodgers' greatest player of all time is obviously Jackie Robinson. I don't think you'll find many people that would be able to disagree with that one. And then I'll name the Los Angeles Dodgers' greatest player of all time is Sandy Koufax.
You're a chicken, but you're right.
Exactly. I'll take the coward's way out on this one.
Yeah, you're a chicken, but you're right. I had both those guys on my list, and it's hard to choose between those two guys.
It almost feels unfair to have to choose between them.
And by the way, I said before that Warren Spahn might be the greatest lefty of all time, and yet Sandy Koufax might be the greatest pitcher of all time. He was left-handed. How can I say that? Longevity.
Yes.
So Spahn pitched 22 years, and Koufax, obviously had to leave the game when he had closer to 10 years. But his 10 years was so amazing.
Exactly. It's like there's an aura of dominance.
Or 11 years,
the best
whatever it was.
pitcher of all time needs to have. And whereas the best lefty pitcher of all time doesn't necessarily need to hold that same level of dominance.
The two can exist together, at least in this show. They're gonna exist together. Honorable mention to I still know a few Brooklyn Dodger fans who revere the Duke Snyder as one of the greatest center fielders of all time. When you had Mays, Mantle, and Duke Snyder playing center field in New York at the same time, and who was the best of the three? It was a little like the Jeter, Garcia, Parra,
A-Rod
Tejada,
debates.
A-Rod thing that went on with shortstops, back in the 90s.
I think you could even still mention a guy like Don Drysdale as being somebody that deserves to be talked about in that same kind of fashion.
Koufax and Drysdale, man. Can you imagine them being on the same staff? That's unbelievable.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
You don't want to really do that.
And then I think what's interesting is then when you look at the rest of this division, they're so much more recent.
Yeah.
They don't have the same kind of length of franchise that...
Except for the Giants.
Except for the Giants.
Except for the Giants.
But I
And so
think
we'll have to talk about the Giants because are you going to talk about San Francisco Giants or are you going to talk? So let's start first with the team that finished second to the Dodgers.
But I think
this
this is almost a less fun one to talk about because it's Tony Gwynn and it's the Padres. It's Gwynn.
Yep. And I think far and away Tony Gwynn is the greatest.
The
Padre
only
of
guy
all
that
time.
I think you could have even remotely in that discussion is Trevor Hoffman.
And I might get into trouble for saying this. I always looked at Trevor Hoffman as a bit of a compiler.
He's just not Tony Gwynn.
No, he's not Tony Gwynn. Hoffman was there a long time and got a lot of saves when the saves was a valuable statistic.
But
Tony Gwynn. And who else? Well, great Padres of all time. Dave Winfield would have to go on that list, Hall of Fame player.
Jake Peavy.
Yeah, I like Jake Peavy on that list, actually.
And he was a really good pitcher for them for a long time.
And that's the thing I like about putting him at least in the conversation as a guy who would be considered because of his longevity with the Padres.
And you have to think about what these guys mean to these franchises. I could imagine because I remember the Padres were not very good when I was growing up, but they had Jake Peavy. And so once every 5 days, you could at least get excited because you got to see Jake Peavy pitch.
Yeah, he was that good a pitcher. So if we go to one of the storied franchises in the history of baseball, the New York, now San Francisco Giants, are you going to pick the New York? Are you going to pick them both? I guess I'm going to pick them both because I look over time and there's a lot of great Giants. There is a greatest Giant in my opinion.
I think because you could put him on the same tier as player as the other guy, but I think it comes down to two guys, and I think that you have Mays and you have Bonds.
Right.
But I think that because Mays is actually a player that's on the same tier as Bonds and isn't connected to performance-enhancing drugs, you can kind of put Mays up there above him.
That's a good argument and probably one I'd make, although I think we both feel strongly that Barry Bonds should be in the Hall of Fame.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I think in this case it's just because it's very unusual to have a guy like that's as good as Barry Bonds in that same kind of conversation. And you do in this case.
I certainly, in terms of his impact on the game, multiple MVPs and championship. Now, I looked at the Giants going way back when, and growing up, you read about Christy Mathewson, right? I mean, just forget it. Even I didn't see him play, by the way.
Exactly.
But the stories about he and Mel Ott, with the leg kick, hitting home runs in the Polo Grounds over that short right field porch of 296.
That is short.
He hit 510 home runs, and Mel Ott was one of the great players of all time.
But the problem is his competition both hit over 600.
Right. But I guess it's just a shout out to old Giant fans who say, hey, those guys were pretty great players. And Christy Mathewson in another era would have been the greatest Giant of all time. I'll put it to you that way before Willie Mays came around.
It's not nearly as long an era, though.
Well, let's finish it out with two, I guess, also rans in the NL West this year. The Rockies finished fourth, I believe. Who's the all-time greatest Rocky?
I think this is one where I feel like I'm kind of doing one guy short here because I'm going to knock him for having played some pretty productive years for another franchise where the other guy has played every season for the Rockies in his career. So I think it comes down to Todd Helton versus Larry Walker.
Okay.
And I think I go with Helton.
Me too.
I think because
now it isn't because you saw Todd Helton play for the New Haven Ravens back when you were in Little League and you
it does help. That does help. That to get brownie points. I've seen him. He might have even signed something for me at one point, though. I have no idea where it would be now. But he was a
Rocky for life.
Rocky for life.
Rocky for life. Right. Larry Walker had some very productive years with the Montreal Expos.
Yep.
Okay. So not that he wasn't a Rocky and whatnot. So I think that to me gives the nudge. Helton is not yet in the Hall of Fame.
He should be.
Walker just got in, and I think Helton will be joining him.
Yeah.
And I put a couple of other guys on there, one of whom I know you like a lot, and the other might open some eyes, but if you look at his statistics, and he played 10 years with the Rockies, so that would be Tulowitzki. I have him actually fourth, and he played 10 years, very productive years with the Rockies.
Oh, yeah, Tulo was really good for them, and I think the other guy is Arenado, and I think Arenado is the kind of guy where if he plays his whole career for them, he could, because he'll be a Hall of Famer if he keeps playing like this.
Imagine if they win a World Series.
With him there.
With him being on the team, he would
probably be able
Rocky
to
of all time at that point.
Because then he would bring them the championship.
So the last team,
I think this is another expansion franchise, and I think there's one guy. It's just it's Randy Johnson.
You brought up the point off air before that Randy Johnson pitched for the Seattle Mariners was a very good pitcher for them. He actually pitched 10 years for Seattle and only 8 years for Arizona. 8 years is enough, as I said before. 8 years,
especially,
and the stats were better with Arizona than they were with Seattle.
He brought them their championship.
Right. There you go. And my number two guy, right,
helped to get them that.
Right.
But it's just that Luis Gonzalez had some really good seasons.
He hit 57 home runs one year. I still can't understand how he did that because he never did anything like that before.
No, that was like a complete outlier in his career.
Right.
And then you've got guys that were really good for them. I think a guy, Brandon Webb, deserves to be up there.
Had a better career as a pitcher and a longer career. Again, the guys that were identified as D-backs.
Yeah.
Like Brandon Webb was that guy.
Goldschmidt. The problem that Goldschmidt might run into is depending on how long he plays for the Cardinals, he might end up being more of a Cardinal guy than a D-back guy. Because he came up late in his career. He was an older player by the time he came up. So while he played a bunch of seasons for the D-backs, I don't think it was more than 6.
The reason I may not agree with that is because I think he's not going to have any more of those crazy good years with the Cardinals. He's a good player. He was a great player when he was with the D-backs.
I don't know if, and as time goes on and that franchise is around longer,
right,
he'll be the kind of guy that falls off just because he didn't play as many seasons with them.
He'll be pushed down the list. So that's the National League, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to push the American League to our next episode because this is a really fun conversation, and it makes us really get into each team and talk about it.
And we want to make sure we actually give each team their due.
It's just due.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at AlmostCoop.